So The Weeknd's musical career has been more than just an evolution of sound. It's a cinematic, almost mythological journey of self-destruction and rebirth. From the mysterious, brooding artist of the early 2010s to this sort of larger-than-life superstar that's been drowning in fame, his latest trilogy of albums, After Hours, Dawn FM, and Hurry Up Tomorrow, paint a very dark yet compelling narrative of a man grappling with his own persona. All of Abel's albums have had some sort of storyline, of course, some more than others, but he is an artist in every sense of the word. And I really want to get into his latest trilogy, what it means for the lore of The Weeknd really, and where we go from here. What is the story and just how we're gonna progress. But before we get into that, let me introduce myself first. Hi, welcome to my channel where I talk about music and music related things that I find interesting. I talk about artists, albums, observations, and events that I see happening in the music world, so if that's something that you guys seem to be into, you're welcome to like, subscribe, and stick around for a little while, obviously. But let's get into the super crazy story. So After Hours follows The Weeknd after a pretty rough breakup that leaves him chasing his vices, and the turning point of this album is Escape from LA, where it's revealed that he's been cheating on his girl despite him pledging to change earlier in the album. It leads to his overdose that he has in Las Vegas, culminating in Faith, where he ends up in an ambulance and he's dying in this sort of fugue state where he reminisces on his relationship, leading to the title track of the album, After Hours, where he escapes the ambulance in order to get back home to the woman that he claims that he loves. And he ends up in this terrible car accident where he sort of like bleeds out at the end of the album. It's a lot to take in. The album came out in 2020. It's like very much a concept album in that sense, where for some reason this isn't just about The Weeknd, but it's the death of the character within him. As he ascends to this global superstardom and becoming somewhat of like a Michael Jackson of the generation. Is that controversial to say? I don't think so. But Abel, who's gonna be separate from The Weeknd in the story, they're like, The Weeknd is the persona that Abel plays, so they're kind of like two separate characters in a sense. But he struggles to maintain this sort of separation between his true self and the entity of The Weeknd. The paranoia of losing himself in this process is very real. It's the rollout of After Hours itself that is a reflection of this battle, and it's broken down into three main acts, where chapter 1 is where we learn of his love. It goes from Alone Again to Escape from LA. He begins with his breakup and he realizes the true value of his past relationship, and he has to confront his own toxic behaviors. He understands that he needs to let go, but in the loneliness that begins to settle in, it has these effects and a very self-destructive lifestyle, which leads into chapter 2, where we dive headfirst into this sort of self-destruction. From Heartless to In Your Eyes, we see that he is emptier, he fills his life with drugs, and this sort of sense of recklessness that he finds himself in Vegas. He finds himself there right before his high begins to crash, and he's now lost, he's faithless, and he's spiraling. Blinding Lights was somewhat the peak of this album, where he ends up overdosing, and In Your Eyes is this sort of final confession. Chapter 3 of this album being The Final Death, where the last section of this album begins with Save Your Tears, which is essentially the death of The Weeknd, where his soul ascends in a way into the afterlife and he sees his ex moving on, yet he can't bear to be forgotten like that. In After Hours, he's lost in this sort of abyss while Abel lingers on. The Weeknd is essentially gone. And it's in this very last song, Until I Bleed Out, where we see that he's being immortalized through his music. Now this transitions us into Dawn FM, where we follow The Weeknd as he goes into the afterlife, but he can't quite get there yet as he's still holding on to these lingering regrets. Now this album, of course, also being a concept album like the other one, it's a little bit more easier to understand in the context of the storyline and everything, but it begins in the car where he died. He is stuck in traffic, and the radio station that is attempting to sort of guide him into this paradise, he's repeatedly told to free himself, but he just can't quite do it yet. The album perfectly loops back in on itself, which represents this purgatory that he's in, a sort of place of reflection and also entrapment. And the visuals of this album again show it perfectly. It's a little bit like Stranger Things, where everything is similar but not quite, and Purgatory is sort of like his version of the underworld, where he can still follow around and watch his loved ones while he's dead, but it is this abyss. This album, it's better shown through the music videos rather than the songs itself. So I'm gonna be discussing those a lot more in this section. But we start off from the very first single of the album, Take My Breath, where he's dressed in all black and he finds himself once again in a club where he sees this woman who is probably the devil. And she has this thing for asphyxiation, so in some way this is sort of his final breath before he's trapped into purgatory. And we never really see him again in the physical world, as Abel has always spoken about heaven not really being like an option for him, especially being mentioned in a song called Ordinary Life. But The Weeknd embraces this place of darkness, becoming sort of this final boss in his abyss. Songs like Moth to a Flame reinforce this feeling, as his ex still thinks of him, but he is forever just out of reach at this point. Meanwhile, tracks like Sacrifice show that even in death, he is chained to his vices and performing for audiences that will just never be satisfied. In the music video, he is no longer in the physical world, but he wakes up on the same club floor as the previous video. And we see the same people, the same sort of club goers in the scene, bringing back this theme of repetition and this just repetitiveness that purgatory has. Though it's possible that these people are also lost souls in purgatory, which would make a little bit more sense. They eventually end up being replaced by these people in robes. So I think more in the context of the album, they are just like illusions made by the Red Lady Devil Woman. But in the video, of course, we see that he is chained to a mic, and it seems that the devil has taken her end of the deal, being his soul. And it's possible that his physical form is still out performing for the elites, as we see in the alternate reality music video for Sacrifice that he is performing on a dance floor in the sort of Michael Jackson-esque performance, once again alluding to the comparison of The Weeknd achieving this sort of Michael Jackson level of fame. It also further cements that he is being forced to perform even in death, even in like the death of The Weeknd, and it's only once he takes off his gloves that we see his hands are all shriveled up and aged and looking just very, very old. Gasoline takes this as it forces him to confront his younger self, a version that is still like very blinded by his hedonism and just unable to see the path that he is doomed to repeat. The older version of Abel knows the younger version's destiny. He knows that he's gonna spend his money on drugs, parties, and just overall living a very numbing life. And the young Abel, who is unaware of his future suffering, perceives the older version as a monster and just rejects him. He beats him up, but he's unable to escape the cycle until he lets go of his phantom regret, which is a song where we hear the lyrics saying, "Where the weekend's so good that he plays all week long," again alluding to his continual performance and just performing of him being The Weeknd and who the people want him to be. It's possible that this is the only thing keeping him from reaching the light or finally going into heaven, is this regret that he has within him. And Out of Time and Is There Someone Else depict these subconscious fears that he has and the unresolved guilt in him. They manifest into a dreamlike sort of sequence where he sabotages his own relationship and he's haunted by his past betrayals. Whatever it may be, we see him bloodied and injured and in an operating room. Though the surgeon doesn't actually fix him, he just puts a mask on him. It's almost a pretty obvious illusion that Abel is masking himself as The Weeknd. His own issues are really seen as just traits of the character of The Weeknd rather than a real person's life and things that a real person has dealt with. He goes through this sort of dream sequence as he dozes off. The entirety of Is There Someone Else showcases his trust issues and infidelities as he needs to confront himself with understanding that he is his own worst enemy. How Do I Make You Love Me marks the end of his time in purgatory as he fights against the restraints of the past and sheds layers of himself in a desperate attempt to escape the purgatory, but his world keeps pulling him back in. He undergoes this final transformation at the end as he's reborn as a child, and the message is very, very clear that Abel is moving on. He's shedding the Weeknd persona once and for all, and it's time for him to now embrace his new beginning. While the Weeknd got to flourish in his world, Abel is finally letting go. He's achieved everything, as Blinding Lights was one of the biggest hits in Billboard history and he played at the Super Bowl. There's not much really left to chase. He is like the artist of the generation, and it's time to separate himself from what he used to be. With Hurry Up Tomorrow now being released, we've reached the final act, where at the beginning it seems as though the Weeknd is still stuck in this purgatory kind of, but he's able to traverse through the past and relive these moments that got him to where he was. He confesses his sins and he attempts to reclaim his lost soul and lost innocence. One of the very first music videos, Dancing in the Flames, introduces us to this ambulance that crashes in him and pulls him out of purgatory and back into reality. Open Hearts and his Jimmy Kimmel performance confirm what we'd already suspected, that The Weeknd will live on as a legend, but Abel is choosing to leave that part of him behind. He no longer needs to chase the validation through the mask of The Weeknd, and Red Terror is this climax of the album where he sees that. Young Abel confronts the monstrous persona that he's created, showing us that The Weeknd sort of needs to be trapped so that Abel can be set free, and in the end he succeeds and the cycle is broken. He can't wait to leave this fame behind and move on, and it's at the end of the album that The Weeknd is reborn as Abel. He's allowed to leave behind the Weeknd persona as the persona sort of ascends into this afterlife state, allowed to live on forever but as a separate entity from him. Tomorrow has finally arrived and it's no longer The Weeknd. He splits into two, one going back to his original trilogy and one allowed to go forward into tomorrow. Of course, the album only came out like a week or so ago, so there's a lot more time for more theories to say about Hurry Up Tomorrow, and I'd love to hear everything that you guys think in the comments below, but I think that that's gonna be it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed, learned something you maybe didn't know before, or found a new appreciation for The Weeknd after this. But yeah, I think I'll see you guys next week. Bye!